During my last video, I showed you how to make this bowl with a router, no lathe or CNC required, but I did need a circle cutting jig, and at that point I didn't have one. So I grabbed hold of a piece of scrap, a bit of leftover flooring, drilled a hole in one end to take my router's guide bush and punched a nail through it. And that did the job, but I got to thinking, really useful jig to have in the workshop, and I could do with something a little bit more flexible. So I decided to make a jig that would allow me to cut a variety of size circles, and that also didn't need a hole punched in the middle of the workpiece in case I'm cutting a circle on top of a finished piece and a nail hole through the middle wouldn't quite be appropriate. So this is the solution I've come up with. Let me show you how to make it, and then we'll talk about it. I'll start by cutting down a piece of 18mm MDF to 150mm by 700mm, but 18mm ply would work equally as good. With my MDF cut to size, I can start laying out for the channels I need to cut in the board. These consist of a wider central channel that allows the bearing and the bearing housing to slide up and down the board, and then two smaller channels, one either side, that allow the locking bolts to slide up and down. So many times I've forgotten to put a piece of waste underneath the board I'm about to route, evidence at the very bottom of the screen. I'm using stop blocks at each end of the workpiece to ensure I can stop the router in exactly the same place on each of the channels that I'm about to route. And I'm going to hold everything in place with the Craig clamp it track and the auto adjusting clamps that go with it. With the 6mm router bit set up in the router and the widest point facing down the length of the baseboard, I can slide it up until it's in the right place based on the stop line that I've marked, and then slide my stop block up to the base of the router and clamp it down with the most awesome Craig clamp. With my stop blocks clamped in place and my parallel fence adjusted, I can set the depth stop to 18mm and start routing. I'll take exactly the same approach for the central bearing slot, apart from setting the router bit to the inside of the lines drawn on the board. I cut the recess for the bolt head sliders and the bearing flange before I changed the setup to remove the rest of the waste material from the bearing slot. With all the slots routed, I can change the setup. I use the stop blocks again like a parallel fence to guide the flat side of the router base and cut the remaining waste away. This is the part where you should be watching me drill the hole for the router guide bush, but I forgot to press record. So here's a lovely picture of the hole drilled. Just a few finishing touches left to do now. A 30mm round on the corners and a 3mm round over on the top and bottom edges. And after giving it a sand all over with 180 grit, time to apply the finish. I'm using a brush to get the finish into the slots I've cut, so it will protect the MDF from usage wear, and hopefully my jig will last longer. I'm using one of my favourite finishes for this template, Polyvine Heavy Duty Varnish. Fantastic stuff, dries as hard as nails, lasts forever. Perfect finish for a shop jig. And the last thing to do is to assemble it. You're going to need these 3D printed items, but fear not, I'll leave the links to the STL files down in the description below. And if you don't have a 3D printer, then drop me a line and I'll see if I can 3D print them for you for a small contribution towards cost of coffee, of course. So you're going to need this top plate that holds a 35mm bearing. You need this bottom plate and these two bolt head sliders, I call them. These bits over here, this is just an M6 30mm long bolt and a couple of M6 star knobs available from all good stores or Amazon. So take the M6 bolts, push them into the sliders. There's a little recess there in the bottom, so they'll sit in nice and tightly, and then they go in the bottom of the jig and sit into the recess that you cut. And then the top plate sits on the bolts and lock it in place with the star knobs. And then this is the plate that you'll fix to the workpiece. Now you'll notice there's a hole in the center and there's also a hole in the center of this piece. The raised section on that will sit into the bearing, and you can, if you so desire, drive a nail through, but you can also use double-sided tape or painter's tape and super glue, thereby negating the need to bang a nail through your workpiece. So it covers both aspects and works an absolute treat. With the bearing in the middle, it slides around beautifully. But don't just take my word for it, let me show you. So a piece of scrap MDF, you may recognize the indents in it. And as that's got a hole in the middle, I'll need some tape. So I'll pop some double-sided tape on the back of this. Now the hole in the middle of the base plate that I mentioned earlier has two functions. One, you could secure the base plate to your workpiece if you didn't mind having a hole in the middle, or you could pop your pin through the center and use it to locate the dead center pencil mark that you've made, and then pop the pin out the way and the tape will hold it in place. But for this test, I'm just going to eyeball it. So I'll put my jig on the base plate, leave it loose, put my router guide bush in, and then I can line it up with whatever mark I would have on there. And you can see how freely that spins on the bearing. You're right. I remembered to raise it up off the bench at the last minute. And that is a perfect cut. And there is proof of the pudding. The whole thing is a really, really simple build. I think you could do it from start to finish in an hour, 2 hours tops, and that would include a coffee break. So if you want to build this jig, you'll need the 3D printed parts. I'll leave links to the STL files so you can print them yourself down below in the description, along with a link to the plans, all of which will be available online, either on my Etsy store or on my website. I will be asking for a teeny tiny contribution towards the cost of running the channel. If you wouldn't mind, I'd be very grateful indeed. So I hope you like the jig, and I hope you decide to make one yourself. If you do, let me know how you got on with it. As always, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ta-ra.